Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom Seeker Live here on Monday morning, September 26th. So glad to have you join us. Hope that as you join us, that you will let us know where you're joining from, and be sure to share comments and questions with us, as your engagement's an important part of what we do. Like to always talk about the what we mean by wisdom and discuss it to lay the groundwork so that we have a common ground for communication. And so, wisdom for Wisdom Seeker Live is a journey. And this journey starts with gaining knowledge. And the knowledge we gain, we can learn from formal, informal. Hopefully, many of you learn on a daily basis, and so we gather that knowledge, which is a great start. The one thing to be cautious about is knowledge is not where we stop. Knowledge is just the beginning, and we need to make sure that we move through the rest of the journey towards wisdom. The next step in our journey towards wisdom is to gain understanding. And understanding is about taking the knowledge that we have gained and giving our experience and apply that knowledge in situations in our lives. And we want to be sure and really think through and gain from those pieces and grow from those pieces. And as we do, we begin to understand ways to work through life's challenges. And that's a great additional benefit. The last step in the process and the key step in the process is moving from knowledge and understanding into wisdom. And the biggest process there is our perspective. It is seeing things from a much larger perspective and outside of ourselves, and understanding how our knowledge and understanding and the use of that applies to our lives, but how it affects the lives of others. And that is such a key part. And as we move into the realm of wisdom, we begin to make better choices, and we begin to learn and grow more throughout our life. So, wisdom journey going from knowledge to understanding to wisdom. So, that's how we view wisdom and what it means. And for those of us, by the way, that are of a spiritual bent, wisdom is really seeing everything through God's eyes and understanding what what life is about from a wise perspective. So, welcome, Gladys and Rick and Rosemary. Glad to have you, and Purva. Glad to have you as well. Appreciate you joining us today for this Wisdom Seeker Live, and it will probably prove to be interesting. I decided that it was an opportunity that we needed to take because we've got an elephant in the room of culture that we continue to not address in the public forum. We have avoided it, I think, because of the potential controversy. And so it is time that we begin to take a look at it. Welcome, Professor Jagdish. So glad to have you as well. So, we're going to be talking about what is considered one of the top fears that we all face, and that is the fear of dying, fear of death. And it's a real challenge. I find it interesting that the top two items that is supposedly causes fear with us is fear of dying, but the second one is fear of public speaking. And I see a lot of people talking about how to overcome fear of public speaking, how to get better at it and practice and all of those things. But I look out and I don't see many people talking about the fear of dying and how to face and overcome that fear. And I need to go ahead and issue a bit of a disclaimer. I don't have all the answers by any means. Now, I have learned to ask some of the right questions. And so today, I want us to all be able to seek and gain wisdom, and hopefully wisdom to be able to begin to overcome the fear of dying. Because the concern is, and as I observe friends, family, acquaintances, that this fear of dying many times causes to have a fear of living. And it causes us to cower. It causes us to not make choices that could help us, could help others. Example, I think this came to a big head, if you will, big issue during the COVID pandemic. Believe that much of the reaction to the COVID virus was based, ultimately rooted even in fear of death. And we had a lot of people began to be forced to consider that they're going to die. And it caused a lot of problems, a lot of fear, a lot of just reactions that were unhealthy. Welcome, Kamal, and welcome, Tushar. Glad to have you with us today. So, fear of dying. And as a result, we make decisions or don't make decisions because of the fear. And so, a couple of thoughts. I like to be very practical and pragmatic, but at the end of the day, we can do all of the right, appropriate things physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. The fact is, and this is a historical fact, is that for 99.99% of people, okay, are going to die. That is a fact. It's not even disputable, generally speaking. And as a result, it seems to me just like jobs. We know that most of us are going to have jobs, and therefore we do what we need to prepare those things and prepare for jobs. And yet, many people have never taken the time to really consciously consider, are they prepared for death? And the reason that is an issue, or the reason that it's important that we address, is that as long as we don't address it, as long as we don't come up with a rational approach to death, and therefore have at least on some level, have something settled in our minds, it's going to keep us from ever being free to really make good choices to be alive and to live, not just be alive. I mean, we're obviously alive until we're not, but it will keep us or help us to choose living, not just being alive. And so many people are just being alive. And I believe it's driven out of this fear of dying. So we need to really talk through some of the possible ways to address that, address the fear of death. And one of them is to acknowledge that it's there. And that's always true with any kind of issues that we are dealing with, is to recognize that it is there and it is inevitable, and that we need to address it. And so once we've accepted that we've got this situation, this inevitability, then we can move forward to take steps on addressing it. And the various options out there, some would offer that dealing with death is something that is something we deal with through religious responses and behaviors. Others, I know of people that don't believe there is anything more than physical life we have, and once they die, that's the end of it. But at least if you consider it and you come to a term like that, you've at least addressed it and began to come up with ways to be free from fearing that. And so it's just an interesting topic that not many want to talk about, or apparently don't want to talk about, because if you look out in social media and in public media out there, newspapers and TV, it's not something people address in terms of what do we do about it? How can we respond? And there is a process that my business partner and I came up with, and we're not completely unique. Our approach is a little different, and that is determining what we can control, what we influence, and then the things that we need to let go of. And the challenge with death is that we can't control it. We don't know when it might occur. We have averages, get that. And I know probabilities based on averages indicate that we'll live to be in our 70s. And so we have that expectation. But the reality is that none of us know that we will live beyond this moment or this day or even this week. And when we recognize that and realize that we can't control it, then we stop making efforts that would be an attempt to control those things. And so we just need to consider it's going to happen, and then ask ourselves, can we control it? No, we can't. Generally speaking, there are people, unfortunately, in our culture now that are choosing to cause their death at their own hand. And that's very unfortunate, because I think that the reasons for it can be overcome as well. But the second question in dealing with any situation, circumstance, issue, whatever you want to call it, is can we influence it? And a little different view that we can influence death in our lives. And the way we influence it is through staying as healthy as possible to at least avoid the inevitable death and putting it off as long as possible. And certainly worthy of using our influence. And with anything we do, we need to get a plan of how we're going to address it and move on. And then the other thing about the death and the fact that we can't control it means that there is at least a part, and ultimately, since we can't control it, that there's a component of letting go. And that becomes a challenge. How does one let go of fear of death and so on? So let me share some of the comments that are made by you guys. I appreciate that. And Professor Jagdish liked the perspective of seeing things through God's eyes as being about wisdom. Thank you. I'm glad that resonated with you, Professor. Gladys comments, I lost my fear of death years ago. I'm not really afraid of much at this point in my life. That's great to hear, Gladys. It's a very freeing place to be, when the value of not fearing death is that it frees us to make more choices, better choices, because we have more options. When we live in fear of death, then it limits the options we have because of the possibility that a choice could cause an earlier death for us. And please understand, I am not encouraging anyone to say, well, I don't worry about dying, so I'm going to go do foolish things. I'm going to make choices that are reckless. That's not what I'm encouraging. Please do not take it that way or assume that. What I'm talking about, though, is the freedom not to be overly concerned as we make our choices in living, that we aren't overly concerned and fearful of death. Let's see. Lydia shares a comment. Death for a believer is going back to our heavenly home, meeting our Father in heaven, therefore is a blessing. And that is another perspective for us to consider. And it's one that I agree with. One of the, I think, a basic question that we should all deal with is death the final thing for us as a human being? Is it the final event? Once we experience physical death, are we done? Is that all there is to it? Or is there more? Is there something beyond death for us as human beings? Or to phrase it in an old-fashioned way, is there life after death? And that question has been wrestled with for many years. And there are even religious groups and a-religious groups that have formed based on how they have viewed that question. But it's a good question to ask ourselves, to really address. Is there more for us as human beings than this experience we call life? And something that everyone would do well to consider. For me, yes, I believe that like Lydia, that our physical death is just a transformation from one life into a different life, and that second life is one that is in perpetuity or eternity. And so, good point there, Lydia. Thanks. Thanks for sharing that. Gladys makes a comment. It comes from a spiritual upbringing, but at times certain things creep in. Takes a lot of prayers and focus, strength, and strong will. Of course, and that even though we overcome the fear, singular, of death, doesn't mean at times that we will not experience fears related to death. And that's actually very healthy. Fear, big picture all the time, is unhealthy. Fears, such as when someone threatens our life by doing harm, that is very healthy to be fearful, because it causes us to make choices that hopefully are wise choices. And so, again, clarification. Fear of dying, fear of death is unhealthy. Fears related to it at many times is very healthy, but we need to understand the difference between the two. Rosemary makes a comment. I have no fear of body death. Interesting observation, Rosemary, and distinction in body death. And that's another factor that we have to consider as we address death is, as a human being, am I more than just a physical body? And if so, that causes us to begin to consider the question of death. And that's part of the journey to explore and find answers. Rosemary also comments, I'm one of those who slipped close to the edge due to severe illness and glimpsed what it is just beyond our earth and our earthbound sight. And sometimes it is those times that facing death, or even there are some people that have had death experiences that have come back, if you will, from death to continue this life we call here on earth, I guess is a way to put it. And what's really interesting is to my knowledge, most of the people I've ever read or heard or talked to that have had that experience come back and say, yes, there is more. And we need to consider what is that more. And again, Rosemary has raised another question is, are we just a body? And my perspective on are we just a body is the answer is definitely, clearly no. My belief, my conviction is that we have a body, but really that is not what defines us. What defines us is our soul and our spirit. We're made up of three parts. Again, my opinion, there are many out there, but I encourage you, regardless of your opinion, is to address these questions for yourself and come to terms with them and look for answers to those questions one way or another. But so are we more than bodies? Okay. And is there more than physical life? Those are two key logical questions that we all need to ask as we consider overcoming the fear of dying. And I think that the people that truly seek answers to these questions can find them. They're out there. Are they demonstrable fact in terms of scientific type fact? Rarely. There are a lot of different evidences out there to help us support some of the theory and some of the ideas related to death, and are worth considering. And something that we should do is explore them and test them for ourselves. But if you're looking for scientific, empirical facts to find an answer to your questions, you're going to struggle a long time, and you're going to likely live a life fearing death, because there is limited information that we have firsthand accounts for of beyond this physical life. And that creates a challenge. So let's see. Professor Jagdish, let's live life one day at a time rather than one moment at a time, because we can't predict what may happen in the next moment. I think that keeping a perspective and living in the present is very, very key. And no doubt, the other thing, and I always have to bring out the concept of balance, is related to this, is that we have to consider the future and to make wise choices, to be good stewards of our life and where we're at. But we can't always be looking at the end. We need to consider the end and have a concept or a plan, and that's part of what we're talking about. One of a saying that I've heard that I especially enjoy or find helpful is that we need to live each day as if there's no tomorrow, and at the same time plan as if we will live forever. And one kind of a caveat or explanation there is for those of us that think there's more than the physical life, believe that we will indeed live forever. It's not a physical life, but it is nevertheless as important and critical to us starting today, this moment, and as we move forward. Welcome, Jeremy. Glad to have you with us today, and appreciate you being here. Gladys makes a comment. She believes that we're spirits. I agree, Gladys, that we are. That is ultimately who we are. Professor Jagdish shares a comment. In Indian philosophy, soul keeps changing its costumes in every birth. Soul never dies. Thank you for that, Professor Jagdish. And that is another perspective in addressing the question of death so that we can make some determinations, come to a place of confidence, if you will, or better, even a place of conviction, so that we aren't always having a question mark in our mind over death, because that question mark will cause us not to make the best choices so that we can truly live and grow, and all of those pieces, including what the term I like to use, that not my term, it's one that I'm familiar with, actually from the Bible, and that is that we can then learn to live abundantly. Let's see. Rosemary, we're here to gather and learn and grow, not just our earthly selves, but to grow as collective. Another aspect considering death and helping us to prioritize and make choices is that if there is more to this and it's beyond our physical life, then how we respond and react to others becomes another consideration. Because if we're going to make choices that don't stop when we physically die, then what should those choices be? Some of the decisions we make end with our physical life. Choosing physical exercise at the point of our physical death is a non-choice, and indirectly, I suppose one could argue that it has enduring effect beyond this physical life, and I can appreciate that, but generally it is not one that has the highest impact on what happens with our total life. And so again, my hope is not to provide necessarily lots of answers, but to help us to determine some great questions that will help and encourage each of us to seek and gain wisdom in regard to death and that fear. Lydia makes a comment. She says, understanding the purpose of God's will for our life here on this temporary place are profound. Here on this temporary place are profoundly preparedness for our spiritual life towards eternity. Our soul rests assured in the arms of our Heavenly Father in eternity. And Lydia, apparently, and by the way, I agree with Lydia's comment. For me personally, that's a part of my conviction. But when we can address questions like that for ourselves, or as Professor Jagdish shared, and begin to address them and come to terms with them, it may not be that you get empirical fact-based, if you will, conclusions, because I don't think that addressing the question of death can be addressed purely on a factual basis. There has to be more consideration there, which, as we've already brought out, includes spiritual or soul issues, questions. And excuse me for a moment. So these are all part of the considerations that we need to have in order to not live in fear of dying. Welcome, Karen. Welcome, Rick. Glad to have you with us. We definitely need to address the questions at hand. And what's really interesting is that if you find people that are dealing with these questions and have come to some terms with fear of dying, you will see that many of them are much more free in living. And that's the goal. That's the hope. This thing of fear of dying controlling what we do to a point that it causes us not to make choices that help us really live. And as the term that I like to use, live abundantly. I mean, again, if you're not dead, then you're alive. No debating that. The question becomes, are we alive to a point that it's beyond just physically our heart beating and our brain producing waves and we move around or whatever? That is living. Is it a desirable state of living? Not for me. Now, maybe some others see it differently. And unfortunately, this fear of dying, the outcome of living in that fear is the fear of living. And people demonstrate this and exemplify this by avoiding risk at all cost. Very risk averse, afraid to. I've even known people over fear of death never learn to drive. And I appreciate the pluses and minuses of driving, but the fact is, to live in most of our current cultures, driving or riding in a mode of transportation is necessary for us to fully experience the possibilities in life. So again, this thing of fear of dying causes us to be unwilling to make choices, to take risks that in extreme cases could even hint at causing us to experience death before our average life is up. And so another question that we need to ask ourselves, are we guaranteed tomorrow? If we are, we're going to behave in one way. If we recognize that we're not guaranteed tomorrow, then it should affect our behaviors today. And this is another part of this exploration of death and overcoming that fear. Let's see here. Excuse me. Professor Jagdish shares a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "Act as if you're going to die next day. Learn as if you're going to live forever." Thanks for sharing that, Professor. I knew I wasn't original in the concept. And I like the way that Mahatma Gandhi expressed that. I think that's a good way that might resonate with many. Jeremy comments, when we fear death, we don't live our full potential. Don't fear death, fear not trying. I appreciate that perspective, Jeremy. That is part of what I'm referring to when I talk about fear of living. That for some people, and it's in various degrees, some people it's very small effect in how they live, but others it becomes a controlling factor in how they live, and therefore it is unhealthy. And yes, potential is a very important thing in my life, because my vision is to help everyone find, understand, and live their potential. So I appreciate that, Jeremy. Take care, Rosemary. Thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate that you make the effort in spite of the big time difference. And it is just always so good to see and hear from you. So take care and rest well, friend. Let's see here. I want to make sure I'm not missing any of these great comments. Karen says, my pastor always say that life is a preparation for eternity. Another perspective, and a good one, Karen, in that if once we've decided if this physical life is all we're going to experience or not, and if we determine there's more beyond our physical life now, then indeed a great perspective is, okay, when I go and make choices relative to other people and things and so on, how do they affect not just this time and in this physical life, but how are they going to affect eternity or beyond the death experience? How is it going to factor? And the more we begin to do that, the wiser our choices are going to be. In fact, part of the value of wisdom, again, we're looking beyond ourselves. And when we gain wisdom, and if part of that wisdom is that there is eternity, then we're looking in an even much bigger perspective as we make choices. So something that might not have impact on us now, but impacts us for eternity beyond the death, if you will, becomes an important choice and consideration we make. How we address that becomes a bigger priority for us. So good comments, and I appreciate everyone sharing this. This is the beauty of this group of wisdom seekers, is that we're here and we're working to help each other. And it's not about me coming on and dispensing wisdom nuggets. I try to do that where I can, but the bigger value is your engagement and us collectively seeking out this wisdom together and being willing to share it with each other. So thank you so much for that. Rick offers a suggestion. It says, read the poem, The Dash. Okay, I think I have heard it before, Rick, but now you've piqued my curiosity. So I've got to go look that up and take a look at it, because I know if you recommend it, there's some value there. Gladys shares another comment. Freeing yourself from fear of dying liberates your soul. It allows you to speak when you couldn't before. Stand up for your opinions when someone else may have taken credit. In essence, you're perfectly suited for success. Yes, part of, and try not to get too far down in the weeds, but part of addressing the question of dying and are we just a body, those alone make a huge difference. Because again, when we start looking at a bigger perspective, and we gain wisdom. And the reality for those of us of a faith bent, if you will, seeing things through God's eyes necessitates that we understand that his view of us and our life doesn't stop at death. And I share from time to time from the Bible, because I think there's a lot of great wisdom there. Whether you like the tenets of the faith, I know that's up to an individual. But excuse me, one of the comments that is made in the Bible is that this physical life that we fear death about is so minor, so small in terms of eternity, that our focus should be very different. And I find it to be true in my life that when I keep things in perspective of eternity, recognizing that in light of eternity, life after death, we are then considering, do I make a choice that will only be beneficial in this brief period of eternity, which we call life. And the Bible talks about it being like a vapor. It just disappears in a short time. When we change our focus, then things happen. We become freer. And in my opinion, it helps us to become wiser, because we are looking at life as we know it from a perspective that's even much bigger than if we only focus on this physical life, and helps us to make better choices. So some of the questions we've talked about that you need to ask, first of all, are an understanding that we need to establish is we're going to die. It is going to happen. It's not something that is a debatable question. It's not something that opinions matter. We're going to die. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding negative or morose. It's not my intent. But I know enough and have found enough that until I face that and say I'm going to die, it's going to keep us from truly being free to live, as Gladys mentioned. And it's so key to come to terms with that and then begin to determine what does that mean for us. And one of the first questions then we begin to ask is, when we die, which we know is going to happen, is there anything beyond that? Or is death, physical death, is it the final outcome? And is that once we're done, we're done? If that is your perspective, your priorities will be very different from those that think it's just a transition time. And each of us has to make that choice for ourselves. And it's important that we are given the freedom to make that choice for ourselves. But to ignore it, okay, to just avoid these questions, this concept, the impact on us and everyone else for that matter is very remarkable. So once we deal with the inevitability of dying, then we can start asking questions to help us overcome the fear of dying. And once we begin to deal with the fear of dying and what causes that fear, which remember, fear, generally speaking, is unhealthy and not good for us. Fears, plural, are different. They're given to us by design to protect us at different times. And so overcoming this unhealthy issue, fear, and in particular fear of dying, because it has been said to be the one of the top two fears that we all deal with. So once we have addressed the inevitability, once we ask the question, is death the final outcome, or is there more? Then when we've answered that question, and what I'm hoping people will do, and I need to really put this caveat out, that as we address it, that if we address it purely in terms of empirical fact, scientific fact, and I have a very narrow view on what scientific fact. I guess I'm old school, but when I was growing up, it was taught us that scientific fact can only be fact once whatever it is thought to be can be recreated or repeated in a controlled environment, not the science that is accepted today that says, well, if it's got a certain probability, then it's fact. See, I'm I'm sorry, and some people may think I'm way too old school, but I just don't ascribe to that. Probabilities means that if it's only 50%, 80%, there's a percentage that is not correct. Therefore, in my mind, not fact. But that's a whole different story and consideration for another day. So once we begin to deal with those questions, that determines our priority. For example, if we come to a point and we say this physical life is all there is, that death is the final outcome, then how we choose to use our time, our resources, our talents, everything becomes very different, because the focus is on what are the outcomes related to those choices, given that when I die, we're done. There's no more. Versus if we believe there is something beyond death, whatever that looks like, a good term that's effective in helping express it is eternity, then the choices we make now in light of a bigger part of life, eternity, become different. Our priorities change. And the value of knowing, coming to terms, having conviction. In other words, not just, well, I think it's that way. No, I think ultimately, as we address these questions and the issue of dying, need to be beyond just, yeah, I think that's the way it goes. It needs to be such that it becomes, the term I use is conviction, again, old school, but conviction means that you put your trust in it, you believe it, you act on it to a point that if it turned out to be wrong, the effects could be devastating. And so we need to come to terms with a conviction about life and death and eternity. What we come to what conclusions we draw is on an individual basis. I know how I have addressed it. And in fact, I am this year in November will be 50 years that I started the act of addressing that question for myself. And it has impacted how I live remarkably. So again, the question becomes about, is death our final outcome, or is it just another part of life and moving on to a different part of life? Once we do that, then we start coming to terms, making plans, getting concepts, and we go through the method of, can I control it? Can I influence it? If not, what do I do? And the best thing is to let go of those things that we cannot control or influence. And therefore, by letting go of those things, the things we can control, we can influence, we have more energy, time, and resources to address those things. And so fear of dying, it's true, that is a big fear. But do we have to live in that fear? And I think that's where we have a challenge. That's what's causing a lot of what we're dealing with. And I believe that I think that most will agree that during the height of the COVID pandemic, people were making choices that were not wise. In fact, at times they were foolish. We're talking reacting to each other even, and building walls between us and destroying relationships over this stuff. And, a pragmatic example, people becoming so very selfish by going in and buying out everything possible for fear that if they don't, that at some point, I mean, ultimately, in some regards, those choices were out of fear of losing our life, losing our life as we know it, or even literal physical death. That drove a lot of people's decision making, that fear, and it's not healthy. And in fact, what's really interesting, if you do some research and if you would start addressing this question, the very fear or anxiety related to the fear of dying actually can cause harm to our body and potentially even hasten our death that we're so fearful of. And so there's so many reasons to address this question head on, so many reasons to seek wisdom in regard to this for all of us. And I have made my choices, and anybody that would ever like to ask and talk about those choices, more than happy to have those conversations. But this is not what this is about. This is helping, hopefully, people to begin to face this fear. We work so hard at facing fear of public speaking, overcome fear of heights or other fears. We've spent money and time trying to address these fears. LinkedIn is one of those places that addressing fear of public speaking. There are many people on here that have addressed that, and that's great. It's certainly worthy to consider, because that fear can also be just as damaging or unhealthy for us as well. But I think we need more people talking about this fear of dying. And the key here is that we don't have to have the answers, as long as we can help people to find the right questions for themselves and move forward with the answers they receive. And when we do that, we have a greater chance of overcoming this fear. My apologies. My voice isn't wanting to wake up good this morning. Professor shares, in my view, fear, FEAR, is forever a regression. Oh, I like that, Professor. That's a good one, because fear, in my perspective, based on what I understand of our design, is so unhealthy for us, it's not even funny. After forever a regression, as most of the time, our fears are never a reality. If death is inevitable, why fear it? Such a great point, Professor. Such a great point. Fearing it doesn't help address it, and it does hurt us in the meantime. And if you're into scientific research and understandings and all that, and you look, there is a lot of evidence to show how harmful living in fear is. And for those of us that are of a spiritual bent, and we believe that the wisdom that the Bible has to offer, we're told time and time again not to fear and not be anxious. Some have said that in the Bible there are 365 references to do not be anxious, which is a byproduct of fear. And so a admonishment, one for each day of the year. And that being true, that means that dealing with fear and the resulting anxiety is high priority. See, Jeremy makes a comment. He says, when we embrace death, we change our opinions in our life. Indeed, part of, and your comment about embracing death, most people No, let me be accurate. Many people, I don't know that it's most, my suspicion is, many people don't embrace death and therefore stay fearful of it. Just, death, another way to look at it, death is a form of physical adversity. And as we should deal with the adversities that come our way by embracing it and even being thankful in it, then we will be in a place to begin to overcome those adversities, including death. And the key is embracing. And I do think that the other part of that is gratitude as a result. And sure, Jeremy, I see what your other comment about it, meaning that we change our options in our life, and that is true. Gladys makes a comment: people fear death because they aren't sure if anything else is there, the unknown. I agree. I think that is the reason that we need, if we're going to be honestly seeking to find out truth, find out things for ourselves, we've got to approach it. And that includes, just because I commented earlier that our decisions in regard to this aren't just about empirical fact, that it has to contain the other elements. That doesn't mean that we throw logic out the window. And it is logical to address whether there is anything after death. That's a logical, rational way to approach it. And when we do that with the understanding that part of finding those answers will include more than just empirical fact, then we have the best chance possible to come to terms with it, address it to a point that we're no longer living in fear of it. Does that mean that we will always, that we would walk right up and to the edge of death without any misgiving or anything? No, I don't believe so. That means then that if we decided we needed to cross the railroad track when the train was coming, and because we didn't fear death, we were going to do it, in spite of the fact that if we do it, we're probably going to physically die. That's not what I'm talking about. That is foolish. So please don't, again, misunderstand it. And also, oh goodness, I'm glad I thought to clarify this. Not having fear of dying is not a rationale at any point, any time, for anyone, please, to take their own life. That is not a wise choice, and I believe it is not a choice that we are adequately prepared to make. So please don't construe my talking about not fearing death as being a rational step in taking our own life. That is not wise. It's not what I'm talking about. It occurs to me that someone might possibly misconstrue, and that is not what I am promoting, suggesting, or in any way endorsing. Let's see. Professor Jagdish comments: I strongly recommend to watch Hindi movie Anand. Okay. Professor, if you suggest it, I can, just on the fact that you suggested it, I can take the value of that, and I will certainly look into it. And while we're recommending things, a good starting point, in my estimation, and this is just my opinion, as you wrestle with this question of fear of dying, look at the Bible and look at people that address the question of eternity. If you decide that it's all about physical life and death and there's nothing after, then there are other books that you probably would want to read to help you choose your priorities and consider what you want to do. But if you decide that there is more beyond the physical death, then the Bible and many, many other books of people that have addressed this. In fact, one I will recommend, and I apologize, I don't remember the name, but Bill Dolan here on LinkedIn has a book out where he recounts his death experience, not near death experience, and how it impacted his life. So thank you everyone for being here. I know this topic, it could be kind of a downer or morbid and not intended that way, but I think it's time that we face the fact we're going to die and come to terms with it so that we're not constantly living in fear of that causing us to make fearful based choices in our life, and therefore really never live in a way that we can have and experience our full potential. So thanks for today. We'll be back next Monday. I'm looking at some guests to join us over the next few weeks, and hope that you will come back. Well, hello, Atif. Glad to see you out there. I wish that I had a way of knowing who's out there without you having to tell us, because I suspect there are people watching that I never know about. But thank you for letting us know you're there, Atif, and everyone here. Thank you. So let's be back next week. Invite others. You know, it's an open podcast and conversation. Look forward to it. God bless you the rest of this week. Have an amazing week, and I pray that you will come to terms with fear of dying so that you can then not have overpowering fear in living. Thank you. Take care. See y'all next week. Bye.